Seattle General's ER smells like bleach and fear under fluorescent lights that hum at 60 Hz. Laura Bennett moves through the chaos with mechanical efficiency, her hand steady on 4 lines, her face blank as institutional paint. 3 years at this hospital and nobody knows her first name. The scars on her forearms, thin, surgical, precise, peek from under her scrub sleeves when she reaches for supplies. She carries herself like someone who has already survived the worst and found it manageable. The morning shift starts at 0600, and by 0900 the trauma bays fill with the usual Atlanta violence. A stabbing on Peachtree Street. A motorcycle collision on I-285. A construction accident involving a nail gun and a worker's thigh. Laura sets up Bay 4 without being asked, organizing the crash cart with the precision of someone who has done this 3,847 times. Suction catheters arranged by gauge. Chest tubes lined up like surgical instruments waiting for a salute. The attending physician, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, walks past with his residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. He is 52, inherited money from a shipping business he sold for $14.7 million, and has never had to fight for anything in his life. His voice carries the particular arrogance of a man who has never been told no by anyone with institutional power. "Bennett, why are we still using the old monitors in Bay 3, he says without looking at her. "This is a teaching hospital, not a tent clinic in some third-world outpost." Laura doesn't look up from organizing the arterial lines. The new ones are calibrated through Friday. The old ones read accurate. "I didn't ask for an explanation. I asked why." He doesn't wait for an answer. He moves on, his residents scurrying behind him, and none of them make eye contact with her. This is the pattern. 3 years of invisible competence. 3 years of being the blank space where doctors look through rather than at. At 0947, the intercom crackles. Trauma alert. Multiple injuries, 10 minutes out. MVA at Commerce and Decatur. The team mobilizes. Laura is already moving toward Bay 1, pulling supplies, reading the incoming note. 1 vehicle, high-speed collision, roll over. 3 occupants. She sets up 2 bays simultaneously. Bay 1 and Bay 2. Crash carts. Rapid infusers. Warming blankets. Suction running. The sound of the ventilator test hissing like something alive and dangerous. She moves the way surgeons move, each gesture economical, each decision already made before her hands execute it. The ambulance arrives at 0957. Sirens cut out. The bay doors slam open and the first gurney rolls through, a man in his 60s with a shattered femur and a probability of survival they'll calculate in the next 30 seconds. Laura steps into the flow automatically. 2 nurses, 1 tech, 1 resident. Her hands are on his leg before anyone has finished speaking. Neuro status, she asks. Alert and oriented ×4, the paramedic reports. Vital stable en route. Pelvis is unstable, possible abdominal involvement. She does not look up. She does not ask for permission. She reaches for the 14-gauge needle and establishes a second for in the patient's right arm while the first nurse is still introducing herself. The veins are difficult. Small. The patient's skin is cool and slightly clammy. Shock is already starting its quiet work. She hits it on the second try. The line runs wide open. She tapes it down and the entire exchange has taken 90 seconds. The second gurney arrives at 0959. The patient is a woman in her 40s with a laceration across her forehead and what looks like a broken collarbone. Conscious. Breathing. Lower priority. Laura nods to the tech, who routes her to Bay 2 with one of the newer nurses. The third patient never arrives. The paramedic who called it in had said 3 occupants. The paramedic now looks at Laura's attending physician and says quietly, the third patient was trapped. Fire department is still working on extrication. Nobody moves. The silence in the bay is the kind that happens when everyone is calculating probabilities in their heads. Dr. Whitfield walks in at 1003, and the entire room shifts its orientation toward him like a compass finding north. He looks at the femur patient, reads the monitor strip, and immediately begins barking orders that Laura has already begun executing. Type and cross. Keep the rapid infuser running. Orthopedic consult. He doesn't acknowledge her presence. He walks around her as if she is part of the furniture. This is what 3 years looks like. Being the most efficient person in the room and being invisible for it. At 10:31, a new patient arrives. The paramedics bring him in slowly, carefully, the way they handle someone they know is fragile. The veteran is in his 50s, deaf, his skin the color of old driftwood. He is clutching a tarnished military challenge coin in his right hand so tightly his knuckles have turned white. The coin is small, worn smooth by decades of handling. One side shows an eagle and shield. The other is so tarnished it's almost black. He is trying to sign something to the paramedics, but his hands shake too much for the gestures to be clear. His breathing is shallow. His stomach is distended. There is a subtle tension in his jaw that Laura recognizes as pain he is trying not to show. "What do we have?" Whitfield asks, not looking up from his chart. The paramedic reads from the report. 54-year-old deaf male, found unresponsive in his apartment. Neighbor called 911. He regained consciousness in the ambulance. Complaints of severe abdominal pain, nausea, no vomiting. HR elevated at 104. BP 128/82. GCS is 15, alert and oriented. Any trauma? Whitfield asks. None visible. No mechanism of injury reported. Laura is already moving. She directs the veteran to Bay 3, sets up the monitors, and reaches for the clipboard to assess. The veteran is still clutching the coin. His eyes are wide and there is something in them that goes beyond fear. There is the particular exhaustion of someone who has been through protocol before and knows how to wait. She speaks slowly and clearly, making sure he can read her lips. "I'm going to help you. We need to find out what's causing your pain." He nods. His hand shakes as he holds up the coin, as if to show her something important. She gently takes his hand and looks at the coin. Master Chief Petty Officer insignia stamped into the metal. Her jaw tightens for exactly 1 second, then goes smooth again. She sets the coin carefully on the tray next to him. "Keep this safe," she says. "We're going to figure this out." She begins her assessment. Palpation of the abdomen. Gentle, methodical. The distension is real. The rigidity is real. This is not gastritis. The presentation is all wrong. She looks at the monitor. The HR is still climbing. 108 now. 112, something is bleeding. Something internal. She knows this the way a carpenter knows the difference between wood and plastic just by looking at it. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Whitfield appears in the bay doorway with a piece of paper in his hand, the interpreter request form that the paramedics had checked off the intake box. He reads it, crumples it into a ball, and drops it into the trash with the kind of deliberate disrespect usually reserved for insects. Gastritis, he announces loudly enough for the nurses at the station to hear. Probably a perforated ulcer. Get him on fluids, run a CBC, and we'll see if we need an ultrasound. No need to wait for an interpreter. It's not a complicated case. He does not examine the patient. He does not feel the abdomen. He does not listen to the way the veteran's breathing has become more shallow in the last 90 seconds. He simply writes gastritis on the chart and walks away. Laura's hands remain perfectly still. Her face remains perfectly smooth. But something in her shoulders has changed. The angle of her jaw is different. She turns to the veteran and makes sure he is looking at her face. "I believe you," she says quietly. "Something is wrong. I'm going to keep looking." The veteran nods. He closes his eyes and holds the coin tighter. Laura pulls up a chair and prepares to monitor him continuously. She will check his vitals every 10 minutes. She will watch the color of his skin. She will listen to his breathing. She will feel the temperature of his extremities. She has been trained to notice the things that kill people when doctors are not paying attention. At 11:47, during grand rounds, Dr. Whitfield will stand in front of 24 medical residents in the hospital's conference room and say something that will change everything. But for now, the veteran rests his head back and Laura watches the monitor numbers climb, and nobody else in the bay understands what she already knows. The room went dead silent except for the steady beep of the cardiac monitor, the relentless 1-2 rhythm that counts down time and reminds everyone listening that something is wrong and getting worse. The monitor's beep maintained its steady rhythm as Laura pushed the cart toward the nurse's station, her eyes fixed on the printed vitals in her hand. Hour 2. Blood pressure down to 94/58. Jugular venous pressure climbing. The veteran's pain had shifted, no longer localized to the abdomen, but now radiating across his chest like someone was slowly tightening a band of steel around his heart. She found Dr. Whitfield scrolling through his phone, his white coat draped over the back of a rolling stool like a flag of surrender he'd never planted. "Doctor, the veteran in Bay 7 is deteriorating." Laura kept her voice level, professional, the voice of someone asking permission rather than stating fact. Blood pressure's dropped 14 points since admission. JVP is elevated. He's in increasing distress. Whitfield didn't look up from the screen. His thumb continued its lazy scroll, a gesture so deliberately dismissive it felt like a shove. Gastritis doesn't require an interpreter, Nurse Bennett. It requires Zofran and patience. The man's anxiety is catastrophizing his symptoms. Let him settle. His vital signs are. Are you a physician? The words came without heat, without anger, just the flat certainty of someone speaking an inarguable fact. He finally glanced up, his eyes meeting hers for exactly 1 second before returning to his phone. No. Then I suggest you return to your station and stop wasting my time with assumptions. Laura didn't argue. She'd learned 3 years ago that argument with authority was a losing game, that a woman in scrubs standing her ground looked like a problem to be managed, not a warning to be heeded. She turned and walked back to the bay, her jaw tight enough that her teeth ached, her hands so steady they didn't even tremble as she checked the 4 line again. The saline dripped at its prescribed rate, meaningless pace for a man whose cardiovascular system was beginning to fail around it. By hour 4, the entire ER knew something was wrong except for the people with the power to fix it. Conference room B was packed. 24 residents in white coats sat in theater-style rows, their attention focused on the projection screen where a chest X-ray glowed. Whitfield stood at the podium like he owned the air around it. Laura stood in the back corner, tablet dark in her hands, the rest of her equally unremarkable, just another nurse monitoring the ER floor sensors, invisible as the tile beneath her shoes. "Let's discuss scope of practice," Whitfield announced, and something in the cadence of his voice made Laura's stomach tighten. Nurse Bennett here believes her 3-year diploma makes her qualified to override physician diagnosis. This is what we call insubordination masquerading as patient advocacy. A dangerous impulse that creates liability nightmares for institutions like Seattle General. He smiled. The residents laughed. It was the kind of laughter that fed on itself, each chuckle giving permission for the next one to be a little louder, a little meaner. "Ghost nurse," Whitfield continued, walking the perimeter of the room like a prosecutor. "That's what the residents call her. Floats through the ER like she's haunting it. Passes judgment on superior clinical reasoning. Suggests procedures without authorization. Believes her intuition supersedes evidence-based medicine." He paused, letting the silence stretch. The problem with nurses who think they're physicians is that they create the exact conditions for patient harm. They distract. They undermine. They plant seeds of doubt in a team that needs clarity. He looked directly at her, his gaze pressing against hers like physical weight. "Remember that when you're tempted to overstep. Your job is to support, not supervise. Your education is not equivalent to mine. Not even in the same universe." The silence in the room felt like pressure. Laura's knuckles had turned white on the tablet, but her face remained what it had always been, still water, undisturbed surface, no indication of the currents running underneath. Only her breathing changed, becoming slightly deeper, slightly more controlled. The kind of breathing that came from muscle memory, from hours in desert heat practicing absolute composure while rounds landed close enough to shake the earth. When the grand rounds ended and the residents filed past her with their eyes carefully averted, she was already moving back to the floor. Whitfield's laughter followed her like a shadow. By hour 6, her shift was fracturing at the edges. She'd checked on the veteran 9 times in 3 hours. His color had shifted from gray to something closer to ash. The pain in his chest had evolved from a complaint to a constant hand pressing inward. She'd filled out incident reports and filed flagged observations, all of it documented, all of it ignored. During her 15-minute break, she stood in front of the vending machine on the second-floor break room, inserting 4 quarters with mechanical precision. Whitfield appeared beside her, close enough that she caught the expensive cologne he wore, something that smelled like leather and ambition. His voice dropped to a register that felt intimate and threatening in equal measure. Security escorts for terminated employees are embarrassing for everyone, Laura. Your performance review is already circulating to board members I golf with on Sundays. Think about that. He paused, letting the threat settle. Think about what happens to nursing references when they come from a terminated employee at a hospital that can't afford liability. Laura punched B7. The machine whirred and dropped a plastic cup of coffee into the catch tray. She retrieved it, the cup warm enough to feel real in her hands, then walked past him without acknowledging that he'd spoken. Her heart was moving fast now, but her steps were even and unhurried. She was Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett, and she had walked through situations far worse than a physician's transparent intimidation. A title nobody knew. A rank that had been erased from every official record the moment her last operation ended, classified so thoroughly that her service record had become a ghost. The supply closet was 3 corridors away, climate-controlled and lined with boxes of gauze, saline bottles, and surgical supplies stacked floor to ceiling. Laura moved to the back corner where the ultrasound probe was stored, the portable unit used for quick bedside assessments in emergencies. She'd used these machines in the field, had performed field ultrasounds to diagnose internal bleeding in combat casualties before the medevac helicopter arrived. Her hands knew exactly what to do, moving with a kind of precision that came from thousands of repetitions. A voice came from behind her, low and careful. I know that needle angle. You ran trauma in Fallujah, didn't you? Laura's hands didn't pause. She didn't turn. The person speaking was Sergeant Marcus Webb, a former Army combat medic who'd been restocking sutures when he noticed her movements. He'd been watching her prepare the ultrasound probe with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years in a trauma setting, not 3 years as a civilian nurse. She didn't answer. The silence that followed was answer enough. We've got maybe 30 minutes before he codes, Webb said quietly. His chest wall showing tension signs. JVP like ropes. I've seen that before. I know what it means. Laura secured the probe in her scrub pocket, the weight of it heavy against her ribs. She turned to face Webb directly for the first time, and when she did, something shifted in her face, just barely, just a fraction of a millimeter, but enough that Webb could see the officer who'd been hiding behind 3 years of deference and silence. Her eyes had changed. They looked like they'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. Don't mention this, she said. 10 words, maximum. Not a request. And if anyone asks where you were in the next hour, you were restocking in this closet. Understood. Webb nodded once, sharply. Military acknowledgement. He'd served with people like her, had watched officers make impossible decisions in impossible moments. He knew what was about to happen before it happened. By hour 5, the veteran's condition had accelerated past the point where documentation could catch it. Laura stood at the bedside one final time before making her move, showing Whitfield the deteriorating vitals from the monitor. Doctor, his blood pressure is dropping. 92/55 now. His pain is acute. I believe he needs a pericardiocentesis evaluation immediately. Whitfield was eating a sandwich from the hospital cafeteria, mayonnaise catching at the corner of his mouth. He looked at the monitor, then back at his food, then back at Laura with an expression of exhaustion so theatrical it bordered on performance art. Gastritis, Nurse Bennett. Not cardiac. Your persistent misdiagnosis is becoming tiresome. Return to your station. Sir, I need you to look at his jugular. I said return to your station. His voice had thinned to a hiss now, the voice of a man whose authority was being questioned in front of patients and families. Before I call security and have you removed from the floor. Do we understand each other? The thing about Marine training, about Special Forces protocols, about the kind of preparation that had shaped Laura's entire adult life, was that it taught you to recognize the moment when talking ended and action began. That moment had arrived. The chart was full. The documentation was complete. The responsibility was now hers. She walked back to Bay 7 where the veteran lay with his eyes half closed, his breathing becoming shallow, his existence measured in diminishing fractions. The heart monitor showed a sinus rhythm that was climbing toward arrhythmia. She had maybe 5 minutes before he would code completely. Her hands moved. The 18-gauge spinal needle came out of its sterile package with a whisper of plastic. Webb appeared at her elbow with a syringe, his movement so casual that to anyone watching, it looked like routine care. She positioned the needle just below the xiphoid process, angling it 45 degrees toward the left shoulder, the exact angle she'd learned in a trauma course in the Helmand province 15 years ago. The needle penetrated the skin and advanced through the fascia and into the pericardial sac with a sensation of resistance breaking. The moment she felt the pop, she knew she was in the right place. Blood filled the syringe. 40 cc 60. 100. 200. The moment the needle withdrew and the fluid drained away from the cardiac chambers, the veteran gasped like a man surfacing from drowning. His color shifted from ash to something approaching pink. His blood pressure climbed back to 88. Then 92. Then 98. Sinus rhythm. Steady. Beautiful. Alive. Laura set the syringe down on the tray beside the needle with absolute calm. Her hands weren't shaking. Her face showed nothing. But something inside her had shifted, the moment when the ghost nurse became something else entirely, something that couldn't be unseen now, something that couldn't be contained. And in that moment, in the quiet bay with the monitor beeping its steady 2-beat rhythm, she knew exactly what was about to happen next. Hour 7 crept toward 8, and the deaf veteran's body began to scream what his voice could not. His neck veins had transformed into ropey cords standing out from his skin like cables under tension, bulging with every labored breath. Laura saw it from across the bay while charting vitals on a patient 3 beds down, that particular distension that only meant one thing. The body doesn't lie. Pain is data. She moved without announcement, her feet carrying her back to him on the muscle memory of 1,000 field assessments. His lips had taken on a blue-gray tint, the color of old concrete, spreading from the center of his mouth outward like watercolor bleeding through paper. His oxygen saturation, which had been stable at 92% just 20 minutes before, had collapsed to 84. 82. 80. The monitor's beeping quickened into a rhythm that wasn't panic, worse than panic, it was the sound of a system in cascade failure, one domino tapping the next. The veteran's eyes found her, and in them she saw the thing every patient carries into a hospital, the hope that somebody will know what to do. His hands trembled as he gestured, signing something urgent to the interpreter who'd finally arrived at hour 6, a woman named Chen who'd been sitting in the corner watching Laura with professional wariness the entire time. Laura didn't need the translation. She needed an ultrasound probe and a procedure tray, and she needed both of them in the next 90 seconds. The combat medic who'd recognized her in the supply closet was finishing a medication order at the computer station, call sign Holloway, according to the name tag, though everyone called him Gator because of a scar that ran the length of his left forearm like a reptile's ridge. He didn't look up when she moved past him toward the equipment bay, but his hand stilled on the keyboard. He knew. He'd served alongside people who moved like this, and he knew exactly what recognition looked like when it was wearing scrubs. Laura rolled the portable ultrasound machine into the bay and powered it on, her fingers already positioned on the keyboard with the kind of automaticity that had nothing to do with nursing school and everything to do with a dust-choked field hospital in Fallujah where the nearest CT scanner was 400 miles away and a beating heart was the only confirmation you needed. She warmed the transducer head against her own wrist, old habit, old mercy, and positioned it in the fifth intercostal space, parasternal long axis, the probe angled like she was looking for something precious hidden just beneath the skin. There it was. The pericardial sac should be dark, a thin line of nothing separating the heart muscle from its outer lining. Instead, it was filling. Blood accumulated there like a slow-rising tide, pressing against the chambers, strangling the organ's ability to fill and pump. Cardiac tamponade. The heart being crushed by its own fluid, suffocating from the inside. Another minute of this and he'd arrest. 2 minutes and there'd be nothing to resuscitate. She didn't call for Dr. Whitfield. That was the moment where something inside her made a decision that would unmake everything that came after. She'd been asking for 8 hours. She'd been requesting interpretations, pointing at the monitors, showing the numbers, and every single time the answer had been a dismissal wrapped in medical authority. This patient was going to die in the next 180 seconds, and she was going to let that happen or she was going to act, and there was no universe in which Laura Bennett, Master Chief Petty Officer, Naval Special Warfare, walked out of a hospital bay knowing she'd done nothing. Her hands moved. Muscle memory, that's what combat surgeons called it, though they meant something different than the way civilians used the phrase. They meant the kind of memory that lived in the spinal cord, the kind that existed before the brain had time to second-guess. The procedure tray came from the crash cart, a 14-gauge angiocath needle, sterile gloves snapped with the sound of rifle shots in the quiet, an alligator clamp, a syringe, the smell of betadine filling the small bay like incense. She prepped the skin over his chest wall, fourth intercostal space, midclavicular line, the same anatomy that had been the same in Fallujah and would be the same 1,000 miles from anywhere, because the body is constant and knowable and honest in a way that human institutions never are. She felt the resistance of the ribs, the slight give of the intercostal muscles, and then the membrane, the pericardium itself, the thin frontier between the heart and everything else. The needle advanced. She felt it puncture that membrane the way a safecracker feels the tumblers fall, the distinct give, that moment of permission. And then she pulled back on the syringe plunger. Blood. Dark as old wine, immediately filling the barrel, 30 milliliters, 60, the pressure releasing in an almost audible rush, not a noise but a sensation, the body's weight lifting just slightly as the strangulation eased. She kept pulling. 90 milliliters. 120. The veteran's shoulders dropped back into the mattress like marionette strings had been cut. 150 milliliters. His color began to return, moving from gray to pale to something approaching human. 180. 200. 200 cubic centimeters of blood that had been squeezing the life out of his heart, drawn back into a syringe through a needle that cost $4, in a room that cost nothing but time, in a hospital where someone had decided his life was worth the 8 hours of waiting he'd already endured and the risk of everything she was about to lose. His monitor beeped. Steady. Regular. His oxygen saturation climbed. 85. 90. 92. He blinked, and his hands moved in signs that Jen translated without being asked. I can breathe. I can breathe now. That was when the door burst open. Dr. Whitfield filled the doorway like something that had learned to walk upright but was considering reverting, his face the color of raw meat, his breath coming hard and fast like he'd been running. 2 administrators followed him, both in suits the shade of corporate gray, both carrying phones already warm from calls being made. His voice, when it emerged, wasn't speech, it was eruption. What the hell did you do? Laura capped the needle, secured the syringe, labeled it, and set it on the tray with the deliberation of someone completing a ritual. Her hands were steady. Emergency pericardiocentesis for cardiac tamponade. He would have arrested in approximately 3 minutes. You performed a surgical procedure. Whitfield's words arrived in fragments, each one a hammer blow. Without physician authorization. That's assault. That's practicing medicine without a license. He spun toward the administrators, his phone already rising to his ear. She's a fraud. I want a full external audit of her credentials. Every single one. I want the state medical investigator here now. She may have faked her entire qualification. He was dialing, his voice climbing into something that echoed off the bay's metal fixtures. Jim? Marcus Whitfield, Seattle General. I need you at the hospital immediately. We have a situation. Yes, today. Right now. Patient safety issue with a nurse who appears to have fabricated her medical background. I'm filing formal complaints with her nursing references tonight and with every institution where she claims to have trained. One of the administrators, a woman with the kind of face that had delivered bad news before, had gotten good at it, reached for Laura's badge. The plastic rectangle hung from a lanyard around her neck, her photograph from 3 years ago when she'd started here, before the exhaustion had settled into the permanent creases around her eyes. You're suspended pending investigation. Security will escort you out. Immediately. Laura unclipped the badge. Her fingers moved the lanyard over her head with the same precision she'd used on the pericardial sac, no tremor, no hesitation. She held it out. The administrator took it. Gator watched from the doorway, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides in a way that suggested he was holding back something large and catastrophic. The deaf veteran tried to sit up, his hands moving frantically, signing something urgent to Chen, his eyes never leaving Laura, but nobody translated. Nobody was listening. The room had tilted toward Whitfield's gravity, and Laura Bennett was already becoming a liability, already being erased. The rain started then, or maybe it had been falling the entire time and nobody had noticed, heavy drops hammering the bay's single window with a sound of applause, wild and indifferent. Laura moved toward the door where Whitfield stood, his phone still pressed to his ear, his voice still burning with the conviction of a man who believed he was saving something by destroying it. She would walk through that door, and security would escort her to the parking garage, and her car would still be there with the same empty coffee cup in the holder, and for the first time in 8 years something inside her would break. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Whitfield erupted through the trauma bay doors like a man who'd just won a war. His phone was still warm from the calls, board members, the state medical investigator, administrators whose loyalty he'd purchased over golf weekends. Behind him came 2 executives in charcoal suits, their faces arranged in the expression of people about to execute a firing. The deaf veteran's heart rate was stable. Oxygen saturation 94% and climbing. The blood Laura had drained from around his pericardium had saved his life, but Whitfield didn't look at the patient. He looked at Laura with the eyes of a man who'd just decided her career was a liability that could be quantified and eliminated. "Clear the bay," he commanded, his voice carrying the particular authority of someone who'd never been questioned before. Everyone but Nurse Bennett. The residents and techs filed out like schoolchildren dismissed by a principal. Laura remained at the bedside, her hand still in position, one steadying the fall line, the other resting on the patient's shoulder. She didn't turn around. She already knew what was coming. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 8 hours of watching a man die while following orders, 8 hours of quiet, desperate improvisation, 8 hours of being ignored, and now the reckoning was arriving in tailored suits. That procedure, Whitfield said, stepping closer, was performed without authorization. Without physician oversight. Without, he paused, savoring the words like fine wine. Without the credentials to justify it. One of the administrators pulled a folder from his briefcase. The sound it made was like a guillotine blade being sharpened. "We've contacted the state medical board," the administrator said. His name tag read Pierce. Of course it did. Everything about him said inherited wealth and borrowed confidence. Given the nature of the allegations, they're opening an inquiry into your licensure status. Dr. Whitfield has provided documentation suggesting your nursing credentials may not be authentic. Laura turned away from the patient. She looked at Whitfield for the first time since he'd entered. Her jaw was set like concrete. Her eyes were flat, the kind of flat that comes from having made peace with things breaking. She didn't blink. She didn't ask questions. She simply waited for the next blow. "I want a full audit," Whitfield continued, and now his voice had taken on the texture of absolute certainty. "Every reference, every credential, every background check. I've already placed calls to your previous employers. I've requested your nursing board records from," he paused, consulting his phone like a man checking his scorecard, "from every institution where you claim to have worked." The administrator laid 3 documents on the nearest metal tray. Forms. Termination papers already printed, already template, already waiting for her signature. "We're obligated to take these allegations seriously, Ms. Bennett. You'll be placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation." "That means," Pierce said, and his smile was the smile of a man who'd never had his authority questioned, "your access is revoked effective immediately. Your badge, your codes, your ability to work in any hospital in this state until the investigation concludes. Could take 6 months. Could take longer." The words fell like stones into still water. No ripples on Laura's face. No trembling hands. Her fingers didn't shake. Not yet. Not in front of them. She simply breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, the kind of breathing she'd learned in places these men would never see, under circumstances that would reduce them to their component parts. "You'll need to clear your locker," Whitfield said. His eyes glittered with something that wasn't quite satisfaction. It was the look of a man watching a chessboard and realizing he'd just won, even though the game was already over. "I've instructed security to conduct a full inventory of your personal effects. Everything you've brought into this hospital. We'll need to verify nothing has been removed." He turned to leave, then stopped. The hesitation was theatrical. The kind of pause a predator makes when it realizes its prey is already dead, and this is just the moment before the body understands it. "You should understand," Whitfield said, not turning around, "that I take fraud seriously. Credential fraud. Scope violations. Practicing medicine without proper authorization. These aren't administrative issues. They're criminal issues. The investigator I've contacted handles cases that result in prosecutions. You might want to consider your options before the board request actually gets formalized." He left. The administrators followed, the sharp click of their shoes against the tile fading as they rounded the corner toward the elevators. Laura stood alone in the trauma bay. The ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm. The heart monitor beeped its steady pulse. The deaf veteran was breathing steadily, oxygen saturation stable, the crisis solved by hands that were now being accused of reaching beyond their authority. She had 1 hour. 60 minutes for her entire career to collapse. The walk to administrative was shorter than she remembered. Or maybe she was walking slower. Maybe her legs were remembering that this was the last time they'd cross this particular hallway as someone with clearance. The HR director, a woman named Chen, who'd always seemed competent and kind, couldn't make eye contact. Her eyes found the keyboard, the desk calendar, the framed photo of grandchildren, anything but Laura's face. "Dr. Whitfield has requested we contact your previous employers and your nursing board references," Chen said. Her voice was steady but thin, like ice on a winter creek. "Given the severity of his allegations, we're obligated to comply. That means," she paused, gathering the words like ammunition. "That means your employment here is terminated effective immediately. Your final paycheck will include payment through today. Your badge access has been deactivated. You're restricted from the premises pending the outcome of the investigation." 3 pages. Termination document stamped with the hospital's seal. Laura signed every one without reading them. The pen was ballpoint, hotel grade, the kind that never worked quite right. Her hands were steady on the paper. No trembling. Not in front of witnesses. The mask was still on. It would hold until she was alone. It had to hold. That was the point of a mask. "I'm sorry," Chen said, and she meant it. The apology meant nothing. It meant everything. This is routine in cases of credential questions. Once the board investigates, if everything clears, we'll certainly consider rehiring. When? Laura asked. 5 words. Simple. The voice was level, professional, the voice of a nurse who understood bureaucracy. Nothing in her tone suggested she was watching her career become ash. Chen swallowed. 6 months to a year, typically. For these types of investigations. Laura nodded. She stood, leaving the termination papers on the desk. She turned and walked back out to the hallway. Behind her, Chen sat perfectly still, grateful not to be the next person in this woman's orbit when the reckoning finally came. Security met her at the locker room door. 2 officers, both younger than 30, both looking genuinely uncomfortable. One of them, name tag reading Martinez, held out a clipboard. "We need to document everything you remove," he said. "It's just procedure." Her locker was sparse. 3 extra scrubs. A fleece jacket in navy blue with a faded SEAL Team 3 insignia that she'd never explained. A pair of compression socks. A water bottle. A framed photo of her son at age 9, in his Little League uniform, the kind of photo that belonged on refrigerators, not locker room shelves. A roll of athletic tape. A tube of lip balm. A hairbrush. All of it, the complete inventory of 3 years of showing up to save other people's lives. She placed everything in a plastic hospital bin. The officers watched. Other nurses walked past, their eyes carefully averted, the way people look at someone who's been diagnosed with something contagious. Word traveled fast in a hospital. Everyone knew. The woman in the trauma bay who'd performed an unauthorized procedure. The fraud who was being investigated. The nurse who'd exceeded her scope. The walk to the parking garage was through the main ER. Whitfield stood at the nurse's station with his arms crossed, watching her pass like a general surveying a battlefield. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. You tried. You lost. You're done. Level 3, South Section, Space C-47. Her car was a 5-year-old Honda Civic in silver gray, parked under a flickering fluorescent light that buzzed like an angry wasp. She sat down in the driver's seat. The bin went on the passenger seat. Her keys rested in her lap, physical keys, not a fob, old school, the weight of them familiar in her hand. She inserted the key into the ignition. She couldn't turn it. Her fingers had stopped obeying. They were shaking now. Both hands. The kind of trembling that comes not from fear but from 8 hours of holding something together while someone tore it apart, 8 hours of following someone else's instructions while knowing those instructions would kill a man, 8 hours of being quiet, being professional, being invisible. The trembling was the sound of her hands finally being allowed to break. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. Her breath fogged the windshield. The parking garage was silent except for the buzz of the broken light and the echo of her own breathing. 40 minutes passed. Maybe more. Time worked differently when you were sitting still. A security patrol rounded the corner, 2 officers on their regular sweep. They saw the car, the figure bent forward in the driver's seat, and kept walking. Nobody interrupted grief that quiet. But that wasn't the worst part. At Seattle General, Dr. Whitfield sat across from a pharmaceutical representative in the steakhouse on Peachtree Street, the kind of restaurant where the waitstaff knew which wine went with which crime. He raised his glass. The ice clinked against crystal. The representative smiled, a smile that said commissions protected, kickback opportunities secured, liability averted. "She's done," Whitfield said. The words tasted excellent. Credential fraud, scope violation, practicing medicine without proper oversight. The state investigator I called is thorough. Very thorough. By the time they're finished, she won't work in healthcare in this state again. What Dr. Whitfield didn't know was that the deaf veteran had been making phone calls. Videophone relay calls, his interpreter translating his signs into voice and voice back into sign, the conversation traveling through cellular networks and fiber optic cables. He'd called a Navy liaison officer at Fort McPherson. He'd given them a name. Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. He'd said the words, "She carried me to evac. She was ordered to disappear. I just found her working as a nurse in Atlanta and they're destroying her career." He'd said the words that would change everything. The conference room at Seattle General held more people than it was built for. Administrators lined the walls, board members occupied the chairs, security stood at both exits, and every desk in the hospital's upper management had been summoned by an early morning memo, emergency meeting, mandatory attendance, no exceptions. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Dr. Whitfield sat in the front row, his lawyer beside him, both of them wearing the casual confidence of men who had already won. Then the doors opened and a 17-year-old boy pushed through the crowd carrying a shadow box, his hands trembling as he gripped it like it contained the answer to every question anyone had ever asked. He was tall, with his mother's sharp eyes and her jaw that could cut glass, and his voice cracked as he moved toward the center of the room. "My mom's name is Laura Bennett," he said, his words puncturing the silence like a blade. "Mom, they need to see these. You can't let them do this." He opened the shadow box. The room shifted. No one moved, but the air pressure changed. The metals caught the overhead light. Bronze ribbons. Silver ribbons. Gold that had been polished and polished until it gleamed with the kind of shine that only comes from hands that knew exactly what they were doing. The boy's hands were shaking, but his voice steadied as he held the box toward his mother, who stood at the back of the room in civilian clothes, her hands at her sides, her face as calm as still water. Then the deaf veteran stood. The same man who had spent 8 hours on a gurney. The same man who should have died under Dr. Whitfield's care. He moved to the front of the room with the measured gait of someone who had learned to navigate the world through absence, and he signed. The interpreter's voice cut through the buzzing lights. "My name is Jackson. My call sign in Fallujah was Jackson, but she called me something different." The veteran paused, his hands moving with the precision of someone speaking a language more honest than words. "She called me brother. Phantom was her call sign. Phantom. That's what we called her when she pulled me 2 miles through burning sand after I lost my hearing to an IED. She was ordered to vanish after that op, vanish completely, records erased, name buried. But she didn't vanish far enough. She became a nurse. And yesterday, she saved my life a second time." The veteran raised his hand. In his palm, the tarnished military challenge coin caught the light. It was worn smooth by fingers, dented from impacts it should not have survived, and when he signed again, every word landed like a fist on a table. "She carried me 2 miles to evac after I lost my hearing to an IED. She was ordered to vanish after that op, but she still saved my life twice." He held the coin toward the room. The interpreter's voice was steady, but the veteran's fingers trembled. The only movement Laura had made all morning was to close her eyes for a single breath. Then the hospital security guard stood. Retired gunnery sergeant, gray at the temples, a man who wore his uniform like skin. He approached the shadow box with the reverence of someone entering sacred ground, and he picked up the largest medal. The ribbon was navy blue and gold. His voice was rough, the kind of rough that only comes from giving commands in places where people died if you didn't give them clearly enough. He read the engraving aloud, each word deliberate. "Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. Naval Special Warfare." He set the medal down with both hands. The room did not move. The room barely breathed. The 2-star general walked through the doors at the back without knocking. He wore his dress uniform. His stars caught light like the medals in the shadow box. He had driven from Fort McPherson that morning. Someone had called him. Someone had explained that they'd fired a nurse for saving a patient's life. He unfolded a declassified summary with hands that had signed deployment orders for 300,000 people. His voice filled the conference room the way authority fills space when it's not forced. 3 combat deployments. For Bronze Stars. 2 Purple Hearts. A mission so classified that her service record was removed from the Pentagon database to protect intelligence assets that are still in theater. Master Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett served her country in ways that most people in this room will never understand, and then she served it again yesterday, in this hospital, when she saved a veteran's life that your chief of surgery had abandoned on a gurney. The general folded the summary. He looked at Dr. Whitfield directly. Your investigation, Doctor, has surfaced some concerning patterns in your surgical records. 6 procedures, in fact. Billed but not performed. Complications you attributed to resident error that occurred when no residents were present. Consent forms with timestamps that don't match OR logs. Your medical board will be reviewing these findings within 72 hours. The general paused. You should contact your lawyer. Dr. Whitfield's face had gone the color of old bone. His lawyer was already on his phone, whispering urgently into it like the words were water and his career was a bucket with a hole. The board members who had been golfing with him on Sundays would not answer their phones for 3 weeks. The state investigator Whitfield had called to document Laura's gross overreach of scope would instead find himself documenting Whitfield's pattern of falsifying patient records. His malpractice insurance would be cancelled. His license would be revoked. His name would be removed from the hospital directory. The CEO turned to Dr. Whitfield and did not raise her voice. She did not have to. I'll need your resignation, effective immediately. Security will escort you to your office to collect personal items. Your hospital credentials are revoked as of 9 a.m. My office will be in contact with legal regarding the formal termination process. She did not wait for a response. She turned to Laura. Master Chief, we owe you an apology that no words will adequately express. We would like to discuss a new position. Full authority. Full resources. We want to build a veterans trauma unit, and we want you to run it. Laura stood in the back of the conference room in her civilian clothes, her hands at her sides, and she nodded once. That was all. One motion of her head, the kind of response that generals understood, that Navy SEALs recognized, that every person in that room who had ever served beneath someone who knew what they were doing could read like a promise. The veteran signed something to his interpreter, and the interpreter smiled. The general smiled. The boy holding the shadow box finally released a breath he had been holding since the doors opened. What happened next did not just silence the room, it ended careers. But for Laura Bennett, it was simply the end of silence. 6 months later, she would be running the Veterans Trauma Unit. 6 months later, the veteran would be working as a peer support specialist, helping other veterans navigate systems that had been built to break them. 6 months later, the shadow box would hang on the wall behind her desk, where every patient could see it. And 3 states away, in a grocery store parking lot in a city no one important lived in, Dr. Whitfield would be standing at a folding table wearing a polo shirt with an insurance company logo, handing out brochures to people who would not make eye contact with him, his hands shaking as he straightened papers that would not stay straight. But that wasn't the end of the story. That was just the beginning of what it meant when the quietest person in the room finally stopped being quiet. Laura Bennett had carried secrets like ammunition. Now those secrets were walking through the halls of Seattle General with her name on doors and her face in the minds of every resident who had ever been told to keep quiet and accept it. The hospital that had tried to destroy her would instead become known as the hospital that honored veterans. The system that had broken her would instead be broken open by her, and reformed according to principles that actually meant something. She still didn't talk much. Still moved with that same efficient silence. But now when she walked through the ER, people stepped aside. Now when she spoke, residents listened. The mask had dropped so completely that everyone could see what had been underneath all along, not a weak nurse trying to survive in a system that didn't want her. A warrior in scrubs who had been waiting for permission to lead, and had finally been given it by the one person whose permission actually mattered, herself. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, if you've ever been silenced when you knew the truth, if you've ever had to hide who you were just to survive, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us what you would have done in Laura's position. What would you have risked to save someone else's life?